To the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. Feel free to use the chat box for any questions during the presentation. If we are unable to answer them during the presentation, they will be answered at the end. My name is Braden Knudsen. I will be your host for this webinar. Today we will be pleased to hear from Christina Thomas and Christopher McAfee with their presentation titled Caring for Your Heirlooms, Simple Ways to Preserve Books, Photographs, and Artifacts at Home. Christina Thomas was first trained as a book repair technician while a BYU student from 2000 to 2004. She later completed the 2-year bookbinding program at the North Bennett Street School in Boston and several conservation internships. She joined the Harold B. Lee Library staff as the book repair assistant in 2009 and worked there until 2013 when she began working as one of the Lee Library's full-time conservators of rare books and manuscripts. Christopher McAfee received a bachelor's degree of fine arts in printmaking in 1993 from Brigham Young University, where he began learning to bind books. He went on in 1995 to receive a Master's of Fine Arts degree in bookbinding from the University of Alabama, where he began learning book conservation. He spent the last 20 years conserving and preserving books, documents, photographs, and other artifacts. He currently works for the BYU Special Collections as head conservator.
Thank you every time.
Oh, right. All right, we're going to talk about caring for your heirlooms. And when we talk about caring for your heirlooms, we're talking about everything: books, documents, artifacts, anything that you might have. Our particular specialty, Christina's and mine, are books and documents. But through our experience, we've learned a lot about a lot of different kinds of things. And so I'm going to start by telling you a story about what prompted me to get started in this profession, and this may be a similar story to some of you. When I was in grad school, my intention was to become an artist, full-time artist, hopefully making a lot of money. But one day I was in our walk-in closet and I noticed that the floor was wet. And I looked for the source of the dampness and I couldn't find it. And then I realized that I had 3 boxes of memoirs in that closet and they had absorbed halfway up water. And I opened the boxes and there were journals and books of memories and photo albums, and they were all severely damaged. There were pages where the ink had bled so that it was beyond recognition. I could no longer read those pages. And when that happened, I became interested in learning how to preserve artifacts. And not only that, and how to help other people preserve artifacts. And so I hope what we have to tell you will help you avoid similar situations.
Kind of before we get started, we wanted to cover a few common terms that will come up throughout our discussion, and as you're looking into taking care of your own items and maybe buying storage materials, just so that you're familiar with them. A term that most people hear often is archival paper, archival boxes, storing things in an archival way. So for our purposes, it means having, whether it's storage materials or the area the things that you're putting around them, keeping them and have things that have enduring value. It can be durable, long-lived, anything that comes in touch with your heirlooms that won't cause degradation. pH is another term that means potential of hydrogen. It refers to the level of acidity or alkalinity in something as a scale from 0 to 14. So when you hear someone talk about something being acidic, then it has a pH level of less than 7. If it's alkaline, it's greater than 7, and pH neutral is 7. And what you mostly hear is materials being talked about as being acid-free, and that means it will have a pH of 7 or greater.
Lignin is a component that's in a lot of papers, especially papers made since 1850. And lignin it's in plant fibers, it's what makes the plants rigid. And when it's in paper, as it breaks down, it gives off acid, which is, when we talk about acidic paper, that's what happens. It becomes acidic as the lignin breaks down. It also and that acidity causes the paper fibers to become shorter, which is what makes the paper brittle. So if you've ever held a brittle book where you just barely touch it or you fold it and it breaks easily, that's because it's breaking down because the paper's acidic. And newsprint's a really good example of lignin impregnated paper. It becomes dark in the light, and that's a result of the lignin in the paper. Relative humidity it's an important thing to discuss when you're talking about preservation. It's closely related to temperature. As temperature goes up, relative humidity goes down. As temperature goes down, relative humidity goes up. And if you work in a major museum or a library that has a lot of money, then you likely have a storage facility that has very good environmental controls that control the temperature and humidity. It's good if you can keep your temperature at around 72. I like to say no higher than 76. For every 18 degrees you can lower the temperature, you will cut the rate of deterioration in half. And it's good to have a relative humidity somewhere between 30 and 55%. Now for you, what this means is it will be different depending on where you live. So if you live in Utah, where we are, you will probably maintain a lower relative humidity. But if you live back east in Ohio, where I lived as a child, you might have a higher relative humidity. In your home, you just have to do the best you can to keep things cool and dry.
One last term, especially that will come up in reference to heirlooms and family items you have at home, is provenance, which regards information about the items that you have, their origins, who has owned them over time. So to get started, one of the most important ways that you can extend the life of family heirlooms is in how you handle them. So that will be one of the first topics we'll talk about as we look at things to avoid and good practices you can use at home.
So the first thing is handle everything with clean hands. I like to recommend washing your hands about every hour if you're working with your family heirlooms. Is there anything else? I think that's it. Clean hands.
Clean hands is one of the simplest, quickest. It doesn't cost any money. Also, when you're thinking about your hands, lotion can be something that affects different items that you're holding, whether it's books, sculptures, textiles. Sometimes the materials in the lotions can interact in a bad chemical way with some of your heirlooms. So it's good to avoid lotions.
It's also good to remember not to touch your nose, your face, your hair once your hands are clean. And that's also true if you're wearing gloves. If you're wearing gloves to protect artifacts, don't touch your hair, eyes, or hair, face, or hands, or nose, sorry, with the gloves. We're advocates of not wearing gloves in most cases. We believe that gloves can make it difficult for you to feel what you're doing, so you can be more likely to damage the items you're handling, especially things like brittle paper. We do advocate wearing gloves whenever dealing with photographs, anything made of metal, and we prefer nitrile or latex gloves over cotton gloves. Nitrile and latex don't have any fibers that stick out of them that may catch on things and snag them. You look at this pocket watch, you can see, this is why we advocate not wearing gloves whenever you're handling metal items. You can see this fingerprint that has been etched into the watch. We assume this fingerprint is from the 1800s. Somebody touched the watch way back when, and it left that fingerprint, which is great for our purposes, but you don't want your fingerprints on the artifacts that belong to your grandparents.
unless you subtly want to be a part of all of them for the rest
You
of their
become
lives.
you become part of history.
So now that you have clean or gloved hands, ready to do some handling, we'll cover a few more handling tips. Many of us have important letters or other documents, maybe even a map like this one, and it's really common for them to be folded. And you take them out of wherever you're storing them and you unfold them to read them, to show them to someone, and you fold it back up. So this repeated opening and unfolding and refolding causes wear along the creases of the fold, and eventually they break. And this actually is the same with textiles. If they get folded and unfolded repeatedly, then they will wear out along those folds. If something is small enough, it's possible for you to unfold it permanently and store it that way, maybe in a protective sleeve or in a folder. Then every time you look at it, it's already flat, and you will decrease the amount of wear in the folds, and it will be less likely to break as soon.
It's also really true that the more you handle any artifact, the more you increase the risk to that artifact. So if you can avoid handling things as much as possible, you'll reduce the risk of damage. When moving artifacts, it's good really just use common sense. These are a few basic principles that you can follow. The first one is use both hands. If you use both hands to carry something, you're less likely to drop it. Now, as I said, use common sense. Sometimes you can hold a book in one hand safely. So if it doesn't make sense to hold something in two hands, then hold it in one hand. But use common sense. And if the item is extra large, then get some help. Don't try to move it by yourself. Just remember, if you're like me, you don't like to ask for help. I hate asking for help. Just remember that the item is more valuable than your pride, and ask somebody to help you move that item. Before you pick up the item, make sure there's a place to put it. Like, you know, you're moving it from one room to the other. Make sure there's a clear space. There's nothing like carrying something somewhat fragile into a room and finding out that the table you're going to put it on is full of other things, and you can't safely set that item on the table. So before you pick it up, make sure that space is clear. If you have fragile documents, or really any documents, it's a good idea not to carry those documents themselves, but to put them in a folder or some other kind of container before moving them. When you handle unusual items or things like suitcases that have handles that may have belonged to your ancestors, it's a good idea to figure out the most stable way to carry it. These are plastic grapes that were common in Utah households many years ago. The picture on the right is the right way to hold them. Two hands underneath the grapes supporting the bulk of the item. The one on the left is the wrong way to hold them, by one grape, which increases the risk of that grape breaking off. Same is true with things you might not think about, but teacups. You shouldn't handle by the teacup handle. You should handle it by the bowl of the cup. Suitcases, it's tempting because we're so used to carrying them by the handle to pick it up by the handle, but I've seen many historic suitcase handles break when somebody picks it up by the handle.
Another common thing that comes up is pulling out a bunch of family photographs, and you're looking through, you're identifying people, and it's really easy to just go along and point with your finger out to different details or someone to ID someone in the photograph. Touching the face of photographs can be really damaging to them over time. The oils that have or dirt or anything that's on your bare fingertips can interact with the chemical emulsion that forms the photograph. That's one reason why photographs are one of the items that are really great to handle with gloves. If you don't have gloves, you can handle them by the edges and just really try to keep your fingers off the face of the photograph.
Your hands can also have tiny rough marks that will put scratches in the photographs. You might not be able to see the scratches, but if enough people touch the photograph over and over again, eventually those will be obvious.
And especially maybe photographs older, pre-20th century, they can have really vulnerable, fragile emulsions that are even more susceptible to scratching. So if you have protective sleeves to put photos in, that's a great way to handle them freely and not worry about the damage that can come from touching them with your hands.
Vermin are a problem. whether they be rodents or bugs, a lot of them are attracted to various kinds of artifacts. Some are attracted to one kind of artifact, some are attracted to another, but they can be attracted to wood, textiles, they can be attracted to the glue in books, they can be attracted to paper in books. And some of the best ways to keep those vermin out is to keep your home clean, to make sure that you prevent or avoid having any hiding places for bugs. Like if you have a child like some of mine and they leave a pile of clothes in the corner for weeks, that could be a hiding place for vermin. So avoid that kind of thing. It's also good to avoid, oh, I went the wrong way. Gotta use the mouse there. If you have food in your house regularly that's not cleaned up, bugs may be attracted to that food. And the problem isn't that you cook in your kitchen and clean up regularly. The problem is when you leave food lying around, especially if it's the same food. If you never sweep your floor and you always leave crumbs, a bug may notice that there are crumbs there, and then they'll go out and get all the other bugs, and they'll come back and start eating the crumbs. And when the crumbs are all gone, they'll move on to your artifacts. So the best way to control this is by keeping a clean home.
Okay, so a little bit of basics about handling, mostly common sense. Now we're going to talk a little bit about storing your heirlooms. Handling and storage they're fairly simple and just some of the biggest keys to helping, really basic, easy ways to add life to your family heirlooms. So I'm going to talk a little bit about shelving. Mostly applies to books that you have at home, or if you have shelves that you have other types of artifacts on. Museums and libraries, again, when they're able, will have a certain standard for shelving where, they'll have steel shelves with enamel coatings or anodized aluminum or chrome-plated steel, coated wood. We don't always have those at home. Most of us probably have either painted or stained wooden bookshelves. The biggest thing to remember is that some of the materials that make up the coatings or the paints on the shelves can interact with the books or the paper items or objects that you have on the shelves, just to be aware that there can be off-gassing and some detrimental chemical interaction that happens. So if you have stained bookshelves or painted, and maybe they're new or they're from the store, give them a little chance to just air out. Maybe you've just painted some built-in bookshelves in your house. Give them at least 48 hours to off-gas and up to 2 weeks if you can before you put objects, books, whatever, back onto the shelves. Also, be aware of doing the best you can to have non-abrasive surfaces that things are resting on. And as you're shelving books, just a few little tips. If you can, it's really great to not have a really tiny book shelved right next to a really big book. If you have a large book that maybe won't fit standing up right on the shelf, put it on its side with the spine down rather than the foredge down or the edge that you open, because when you have the foredge down, then gravity really works on the spine and those covers are going to break off. If you have really large, I've seen some really large Bibles, family Bibles, and if you can store them horizontally instead of vertically, that can also really help them stay in better shape and keep the boards on the book longer. And if you're in an earthquake zone like we are in Utah, finding a way to anchor your shelves will help. I don't even have that, and I think about it all the time.
Usually they're anchored at the top with a bracket screwed into the shelf and then into the wall.
Some people have little shelves on the edges of their shelves to keep the books from falling off, but that's in a dream world, I think, for that to be really common. Another thing that comes up is, if possible, to keep things off the lowest shelves or at least 4 to 6 inches away from the floor. I've had a couple of friends whose parents have experienced floods, and they did have slightly higher elevated bookshelves, so the water wasn't high enough that it actually reached the books, and it saved them a lot of trouble in dealing with wet books.
Light may be, next to humans, in my opinion and in my experience, the most damaging thing to artifacts. And you've probably seen If you have books on a shelf in a room that has a window, notice that the spines of those books turn a different color than the rest of the cover, and that's just because of the light. And it doesn't take a lot of light, just a little light over a long period of time can cause damage to artifacts. And we often say it causes fade, but it doesn't always cause fade. Sometimes it causes items to darken. Sometimes it causes them to become brittle. You've probably experienced this if you have children who leave their plastic toys in the backyard all year. By the end of the year, they're just chipping apart easily. So there are different kinds of light. There's infrared light, that's basically heat. You want to keep things out of the heat, but that's really more of a temperature discussion. There's the visible light spectrum, and there's the UV light spectrum. And we often in the preservation world talk about reducing UV light, but really all light causes damage. So reducing the UV light is a good thing because it reduces some of the light spectrum, but we can't eliminate the visible light spectrum and still be able to view our artifacts. So we have to leave the visible light spectrum alone, and that means that some damage is being caused to our artifacts if they're in the light. Now look at this little image below the light spectrum. That's an experiment we did several years ago, and we exposed the strips of material on the right. There's newsprint, there's paper, there's cloth, different kinds of things, and we exposed them to the equivalent of at 5-foot candles for 6 months, and 5-foot candles is the low end of what a museum might exhibit things at. 50-foot candles for 6 months, and that's equivalent to about what you'd find in an office space, and 500-foot candles for 6 months, which is what you would find outside. I just put up the image of the 50-foot candles because that's going to be more like what's in your home, and you can see to the right of that line there is some change. The newsprint has turned brown, the blue paper has started to fade, and it's hard to tell from this photograph, but if you look closely you can see it, that everything else has faded a slight amount in just 6 months. So you put something on the wall in your home, or say you put a quilt that belonged to your ancestors on your bed and it's in your bedroom where you keep the windows open all the time, those things are going to become damaged, and it's not going to take very long for that to happen. This is an example of what can happen to things hanging on the wall. We call this mat burn. What's really happening is the mat that was around these, or the frame that was around these, has protected the paper on the edges from the light, and the paper in the middle was not protected, and it was darkened by the light. Photographs can be susceptible to fade. The picture of Darwin on the left, you can see on the right-hand side of that photograph has faded, so there was probably some light falling just in that area on the photograph. Light can also change the color of color photographs. The colors the dyes that were used to print the photographs will fade at different rates. And so you'll end up with the final color of your photograph being kind of orangish, reddish color. So you need to keep color photographs out of the light. And if at all possible, instead of storing your originals, or instead of displaying originals, display copies of your photographs or of your drawings or other artifacts. I think especially keep textiles out of the light. Textiles are highly susceptible to light damage in most cases. In fact, in the conservation world, we consider textiles to be the most sensitive to light damage.
Chris already talked a little bit about relative humidity. Just wanted to talk a little bit more about how you can apply those principles at home without having the resources of a museum or library. Basically, it's about maintaining stability and avoiding extremes. So, as you can see on the slide, avoiding displaying heirlooms in a bathroom. The bathroom really fluctuates in humidity. It goes way high when someone's showering or bathing, and then it goes way back down to normal again. It can get warmer in there. Any exterior walls are going to fluctuate more. And then storage units don't really have any climate control, so they're going to fluctuate with the environment around them. And attics especially, but also basements can fluctuate a lot. But sometimes you don't have a choice. Sometimes that's the space that you have. So that's the situation for me. I live in the attic of a 90-year-old house. So it's a 2-bedroom apartment, and one of the bedrooms has a little door, and it goes into the real attic, and that is where I can store stuff. So, and it will get 90 plus degrees in the attic in the summer, even though we have central air and we have like a new furnace. There are no central air vents that go into the attic. So it's a pretty unruly environment. So what I've done is I've taken out the things that I care the most about, that I want to be more stable. I don't store them in the attic. I have my photo albums on a shelf. I have some other materials, journals and things that I just that matter the most to me, and I don't put them there. But it's a select because I don't have room for everything. And then everything that's in the attic is in storage containers that are going to protect them from problems in the attic. So when I moved in there were sometimes leaks, and so I have some things in plastic bins. And we also got our roof redone, and no one told us that was happening. And I came back to find piles of soot over everything in the attic. But because they were all stored in boxes and some plastic bins, nothing was really damaged except the exterior of the storage containers. So that's just, if you have that, you can mitigate some of those problems or issues with the containers you use, and be selective about what you don't put in those environments.
I'd add that consider where you live. This photograph on the far right is actually my basement, and there's a lot of different things stored in there, but you can't see it in the photograph, but in the back on the far right, there are several boxes like Christina was talking about that have some of my personal heirlooms in. Some of the ones are actually from that flood I talked to you about earlier. But because I live in Utah, my basement isn't that damp like my dad's basement in Ohio was. So I'm not so worried about the relative humidity causing a problem. But I am worried that someday we'll have a flood and those items will be damaged.
That's just a few more points that we kind of already covered.
Oh yeah.
Looking to keep things cool and dry. You're not necessarily going to be measuring your exact temperature, and most of us don't monitor the relative humidity in our houses. So again,
Right.
Stability, cool and dry is always better than hot and humid.
Do what you can to maintain stability. If you have air conditioning, that's a plus. If not, don't stress about it. Just do the best you can with what you have. Storage containers go a long way to protecting items. These are various kinds of storage containers that are available through different archival suppliers. There's that word archival again. These materials are acid-free. They're strong. Some of them are made of paper. Some of them are made of inert plastic, inert polyester. Some of them, something to remember is it's good to buy archival materials that are acid-free, but when you're shopping for containers to store your photographs, it's more important to consider whether they have passed something called the photographic activity test. Sometimes that's listed as PAT. Because sometimes even if a folder is acid-free or considered archival, it will still not be good for photographs. So keep that in mind. Something else to think about is on the right, there's a document that has been stored in what we call an L sleeve. It's a sheet of polyester, 2 sheets of polyester that have been sealed on 2 sides in the shape of an L. And it's okay to store them in the L sleeve and then also in its own folder. In fact, we store a lot of documents. We put them in folders, and then we put those folders in archival boxes.
It's nice to have a little bit more of a rigid support for it sometimes. All right, organizing heirlooms.
We're going to talk about this is an actual example of a library or an archive somewhere. I think it was in Oklahoma, but I can't remember. This on the left is what it looked like before it was processed, and on the right is what it looked like after it was processed. And that's what we want. We want our organized spaces to look like that. This is an example closer to home. That's my home. On the left is how you should not store things. Now, fortunately, I can tell you that those had just come home, so they hadn't had time to be stored yet. But on the right, this is what my wife has done to store my children's elementary school years. She bought these inert plastic containers. that you can see through and that light can get into, but they're stored in a dark room and they're labeled. And this organization makes it easier for us to pull the things that we want to look at when we want to look at them. So it does a few things. It reduces risk because we don't have to handle the items as much as possible, as much as we don't have to handle the items more than necessary. It protects them from the environment. It also, I just lost my train of thought here. Well, I can't remember. It's it's a good thing to have things organized. Oh, it forced us to weed out what we did want to keep versus what we didn't want to keep. If you keep too many things and it becomes unwieldy to go through it, then you'll end up not going through it. And I'll give you a personal example. When my dad passed away, we went into his home, and my dad was a pack rat and terrible at organization. And we could not get through everything in the amount of time we had, and we ended up having to turn the house over to a company that would clean it out for us. So we hope we got the important things out, but we will never be sure because he didn't keep things organized. So if it's important to you that your history gets passed on, organize your space and make sure you weed out so that you only have the artifacts necessary to tell your story and nothing more.
One aspect of that organization that you might not think about on a regular basis is marking and labeling your artifacts and heirlooms. If you're like me, you've inherited some things from grandparents and family members, and you know it belonged, you know the provenance of it, like just back to the grandparent that gave it to you, but you might not know where they got it and what stories go with it. I could do this better myself, but developing a habit of labeling and telling the story, whether you're writing on an acid-free card, like depicted in these pictures with a cotton tie that you can connect to the artifact, or sometimes it's really common for people to label photographs. A lot of times people write on the face of the photograph, which is kind of a shame sometimes because it disrupts the image. Even writing on the backs of photos is really common as well, and that's okay. It's best if you can keep the labeling to the edges of the photograph and not write super hard and use a pen like these micron pens in the picture. But doing something to be sure that why the item is significant is recorded somewhere, so that family members down the line know why it matters and what's important about it. And also marking and labeling the storage boxes and items that those things go into.
This piano is in my home. This was my mom's piano. She got it when she was 13, and I told my daughter that if she learned to play the piano, she could have it. And fortunately, my daughter plays the piano almost every day. So I need to label this piano, which I haven't done. This is an example of what you can do. And these are the kinds of things I would include in that label. I would include what kind of piano it was, so that if the label ever got detached, people would be more likely to reconnect it with the piano. Give a little bit of a story about the piano, and especially since my daughter is going to inherit it, I would like her to know that it belonged to her grandmother, whom she never knew. But this can be a way for her to connect to her grandmother. I just put the date the label was written. Sometimes people want to know that, and who wrote the label. And that helps you keep a story of the provenance that we were talking about earlier.
And especially, maybe in photographs in particular, it can be really nice to include information also about where people are, and again, years and things like that.
Definitely, date and location.
A recent donation that came to the BYU library, the books that came with the donation, the person who kept the books actually kept really detailed information about where they got the book and why it mattered, and it really added to that item, just the history and the provenance of the item in the collection. Just it made it more meaningful having that extra information.
Yeah, sometimes artifacts are important not for what they are, but for who they belonged to.
So we're going to finish up by talking a little about treating damaged heirlooms. We're going to talk first about some of the common damage that you'll see that will happen and a little bit about what we would do and what you can do at home, and also when it would be best to consult with a conservator or another professional who can help you. So tape and rubber cement are some of the most common issues that come up. It can be really tempting at home to just tape that loose page back in or duct tape that cover back on that book. Any of those things. A lot of scrapbooks, especially older, have everything's been pasted in with rubber cement. All the pictures here show what happens with tape and rubber cement and different adhesives over time, these glues. The tape does this thing called cross-linking where the adhesive kind of bonds with the paper fibers, and it can make the paper kind of clear and yellowed, and it can be reversed with some pretty heavy solvent treatment sometimes by a conservator. It can make the paper brittle. The rubber cement stains whatever it touches, and so if you have things you need to glue into a scrapbook, there are better glues today, or even just putting, if you have a news article, putting in like a photo sleeve or use photo corners to attach things. So there are alternatives to tape and rubber cement. A lot of tapes today won't be as bad as tapes 100 years ago, but there are definitely alternatives. Even with a book, you saw some archival boxes in previous pictures. There are great boxes you can custom order for your books, and they can keep your books that are breaking all together if you can't afford to get them repaired without duct tape. It's great.
Paper clips, you can see on the left, obviously they can cause damage, and that can be caused not if the newspaper gets wet, or in this case newspaper. It can be caused just by high relative humidity. So it's good to avoid paper clips. Of course, today we use stainless steel paper clips often, but those, even if they won't rust, still dent the paper and can tear the paper as they're being removed. Plastic, for that reason, paper clips can also cause damage. Sticky notes seem really innocuous, but they're not. They leave a residue behind, I think, every time, if not every time, almost every time. And that residue over the years can become stained. Another thing that sticky notes do is if you leave them on something too long, they get really stuck, and when you try to remove them, you can tear the page that they're stuck to.
It even pulls off ink.
Yeah.
In certain books.
So I shouldn't say I avoid sticky notes. I use sticky notes. I just don't use them on valuable items or items that are important to me. Rubber bands around things, rubber bands are very useful, but if they are left on an item, even for a short period of time, it does not take very long for a rubber band to degrade and to leave residue behind that's difficult to remove. So avoid using rubber bands on your heirloom.
They can also dig into paper and cause it to tear, especially if it's something that's got a soft cover, or if it's a group of papers that has a rubber band around it.
Yeah.
Oh, mold. This looks fun. Okay, so mold is a common thing you could encounter. You could confuse it with dirt. It'll be more common if you've had items go through water damage. These are extreme pictures. If you encounter something like this in your items at home, I would suggest contacting a professional to help you vacuum that and clean it off.
A professional disaster recovery.
Yeah, it could be disaster recovery. It could be a conservator in the area. Some areas actually have conservation centers nearby.
A mycologist who's a mold specialist.
But the first thing that I always think of when I think about mold is I want to put on gloves and I want to put on a mask. I actually have developed more severe allergies to mold from working in a library. But if you don't have gloves, then just try not to touch your face until you can wash your hands.
Even people who aren't allergic to mold can have an allergic reaction to mold if the concentration is high enough in the air. So you need a well-ventilated space, or you need to work outside if you're working with mold.
Yeah, if you have something that's maybe less moldy than this, you could take a soft brush, take it outside, brush off the mold that will come off. And you could even store it in one of those L sleeves afterwards if you don't want to have to touch it and have it protected. if you are in a really humid area, it can reactivate mold spores. So that's something to look out for from time to time.
It might also be good to know that mold begins to flourish at around 72 degrees Fahrenheit.
And what humidity?
Any humidity, 72. But yeah, keeping the humidity low and the temperature low will reduce the risk of mold damage.
Another good reason to not hang any artwork or photographs in a bathroom that you care about.
Or on an exterior wall where condensation might form.
These are a couple examples of things you might think are molds that aren't exactly molds. Leather bindings can develop something called fatty bloom, and it's basically fatty oil, sometimes a part of the tanning process, that migrate back up through the leather, and then they crystallize on the surface as they interact with the environment around them. Some studies, people have noticed that this happens more with books closer to air conditioning vents. It can be cleaned off pretty easily with a Q-tip and alcohol, just rolled across it gently. On the right, this paper has brown spots throughout it. It's called foxing, and it typically, most people consider that it comes from impurities in the paper from when the paper was made, and then they are interacting again with the environment around them, with the air, with the levels of moisture. It's not a problem. It's not dangerous like mold. It can be unsightly. It takes a lot of kind of harsh paper conservation treatment and bleaching to get this spotting out if you were really wanting it to look white again. So mostly you just kind of let foxing be. If you have some beautiful artwork and you just want it to be clean of foxing, then you could talk to a conservator about the options for treatment.
Yeah, you need to not do it yourself. Because any treatment that you might think will reduce the foxing could cause additional or worse damage. Rodents, we talked a little bit about this earlier, and they can leave behind urine and feces, and they can gnaw on things. If you come across items with urine or feces on the cover, again, this is a health issue. You should wear a mask and gloves, but you can clean this off with I would use alcohol on a soft cloth or a Q-tip, as Christina mentioned with the mold. But you shouldn't keep it in the open until it's cleaned up. In fact, I would probably keep it in an unsealed Ziploc bag. Unsealed because that allows air circulation, but if it's in a Ziploc bag, that will prevent any contaminants from getting out.
If there's a huge problem, again, it's something you could talk to professionals about dealing with. And rodents are most often going to come up in connection with storage units. And maybe I had a mouse in my attic for the first time in 7 years, so that was surprising to me. But it's a great reason to store things in a storage unit in a way that is less accessible to rodents. So plastic versus cardboard, for instance, and not just having maybe your grandma's quilt in a bag on top of the boxes, but something that a mouse can't get to or a rat can't get to. Insects. So a lot of insects are actually, most of these are pretty small. Some of them even kind of microscopic. Like I've never just seen a book louse. I always see it under a microscope. So this goes back to what Chris said earlier, just about having a clean environment that's less attractive to insects. Just wanted to include a picture of insect damage in a book so you know it when you see it. Maybe if you may buy something from a used bookstore and it will have this damage. That doesn't necessarily mean the bookstore has a problem with bugs somewhere in its life that it did. But the main point is just these are the insects that are the most problematic with book and paper-based materials and textiles, especially the carpet beetles for textiles. So mostly just that's what they are. Be on the lookout for them. And again, back to the keeping things clean. Anything to add?
There are other insects that will like other kinds of artifacts. So obviously termites like wood. There are other insects that will bore into wood and lay eggs, and their babies will emerge and continue eating the wood. So just be aware of those kinds of things. There are ways to eradicate those insects, fumigation, freezing, heating, but you should contact a professional to find out what will work best. We've talked a little bit about acidic materials. Newspapers are highly acidic, as well as many papers created since 1850. Acidic materials not only break down themselves, but they can begin to break down anything around them. So the newsprint on this in this book could be, and I don't know because I haven't seen the book in person, but I think you have. Is that, yeah? It could be causing the rest of the book to become brittle. So if you have items that you know are acidic that are worth saving, it's a good idea to put some kind of barrier between them and the things that are around. So I showed you L sleeves earlier, made of plastic, clear polyester. If you put them in L sleeves before you put them in a book or a folder, that will help. Another thing that you can do is photocopy the acidic items and save the photocopied version, especially if you photocopy it onto archival paper.
I guess you could even scan things.
Yeah, you could definitely scan things. That's certainly an option today.
I wanted to give an example of one of my own family heirlooms, and that was damaged, and how I dealt with it. So this is my grandpa's driver's license from 1933, and the first photo just shows the condition it was in when it was handed to me by my dad in a little white envelope. And I think that's actually in pretty good shape for being that old and that flimsy of a piece of paper stored in an envelope. It was probably stored in a file, I'm not sure. I took a photograph of it not only for this presentation, but just as a record of this is what it looked like, which is a really common practice in conservation. The next thing I wanted to do was get any surface dirt off of it. So I'm using an emulsified rubber sponge, which is also called a smoke sponge that you can get. And it's great for surface cleaning things. This driver's license was a little fragile to use the smoke sponge at like full force. So I did it pretty delicate. There are other types of cloths or things you can use to brush dirt off, or even like a soft brush, but to get dirt off of surfaces. So I took the sponge to both sides. And then I took a little metal spatula and I took the rounded end and I gently decreased or unfolded the parts that were folded over. And you can get these spatulas pretty easily as well. I also used my fingers to fold it over. Then I used a heated tool that we have in our lab. It's actually a wood burning tool and it has a modified foot for what we do. And I use that to kind of iron those little folds.
At a low temperature.
Yeah, at a really low temperature. And then instead of, this is something we have in the lab that most of you won't have at home. Instead of tape, we have a couple different tissues that we use to connect tears and reconnect tears in paper. So what I'm using in this picture is a lens tissue that's backed with a heat-activated adhesive, and it's just cut in a strip just a little wider than the tear, and then I basically stick it on with that tacking iron that I'm using. And I applied the tissue along the back. I picked the side where it would disrupt the least amount. So most of the writing and the typing of driver's license is on the front. So the middle picture just shows the other side now that everything's been flattened and mended. And the last thing I did was put it in a protective sleeve, and I'll probably put that in a rigid folder so that it's easy to handle, it's easy to look at, but people don't actually have to touch it. But it's still open on two sides, so if anyone needs to take it out, you can still access it. So we're going to talk a little bit more about treatments you can do on your own, just little simple things.
These are things we feel comfortable telling you to do. There are a lot of things that conservators do that if we tried to tell you, it would take too long for us to teach you how to do it. But there are a few things that we think you can do on your own. All right, so this is, I talked a little earlier about paper clips being a problem. Here's a way to remove paper clips. You can take a stiff card, a 3x5 card, and slide it under the paper clip, and then flip the paper over and slide a card under the other side. And then grabbing both sides, you can just pull off the paper clip between the cards, and that keeps the paper clip from scratching the document.
It's pretty common to have a book where a page comes out or so. I don't know if I would recommend this for like a really rare, valuable book. You'd have to decide for yourself what you feel comfortable with. But a simple way to just stick a page or two back in is to mask off maybe about 1/8 of an inch of the edge of the page that goes towards the spine. Brush some glue over it. I'm using a glue that we use that's archival and it's dry as clear and it's flexible. It's called polyvinyl acetate. But you could use a glue stick for your home purposes. And you can just brush the glue on it and then stick it back in place where it goes and rub it down. And that's pretty simple. It could be nice if you just have a pesky page that fell out. Yeah.
Sometimes you'll have documents that are rolled and they don't want to unroll very easily, and sometimes you try to unroll them and they tear because you can only hold it in one spot or another. So here's a simple way to unroll those kinds of documents. Now, don't do this with photographs because it doesn't work for all photographs and it can cause damage to certain kinds of photographs. If you need to unroll a photograph, you should consult a conservator first. But paper documents in general, this should work fine for. And the way it works is you start with 2 containers, one container smaller than the other, and in the large container you put water. And the small container needs to be able to fit inside the large container. So you place the small container in the large container and then place your documents in the small container so they're not in the water. And then when you put a lid on it, it will create a humid environment around the documents. You don't want to leave it too long because you'll run the risk of mold growth. But if you put them in the afternoon and leave them in until the morning, you can pull those documents out, and because they're damp, they should unroll pretty easily. So you unroll them, you can put some weights on the corners so that they dry. It says here on the slide to press them between blotters. Blotter paper is a paper that's highly absorbent and it will wick the moisture out of the document. If you don't have blotter paper, you can just unroll them and let them air dry. And usually when they're dry, they won't roll back up. Occasionally, you'll need to put them through this process one more time, and the second time usually does the trick.
Another common issue is little tears, especially in children's books, where it'll tear and you can see kind of a white part in between the paper under the colored printing. This kind of a tear that's not just straight through, like if you cut with scissors, but it has sort of a dimension to it, dimensionality, is called a scarf tear. And you can apply adhesive to the edges of the tear, put some wax paper or parchment paper underneath before you apply the glue, and just as shown in the video, a little bit of glue, press it down with your finger, and it should stick right back together. I wouldn't recommend doing this if you have library books, because the library is going to want to repair the book its own way, but if books in your own collection that matter, if they're severe, then again, it might be something you at least want to consult with a conservator about.
You should always consult a conservator when the item is incredibly valuable, when you are unsure of your own abilities, sometimes even when you are sure of your own abilities, and if you don't understand the principles of conservation. One of the things we try to do in conservation is make our repairs reversible. So we understand what kinds of materials we can use to repair things in a way that the repair can be undone. So if you're repairing one of your children's books and it's not that important, I don't think you need to consult a conservator. But if you're repairing, if you're like one of my dad's children's books, which is worth a lot of money, you should hire a conservator.
Yeah, something's kind of irreplaceable or one of a kind to you. And sometimes it's not one of a kind, but it is to your family because of the stories of the people who had it.
I should mention that conservation is usually pretty expensive. It's relatively expensive. You would pay a conservator maybe as much per hour as you would pay your mechanic. But people have to get their cars fixed, so they always pay the mechanic, but they don't want to pay the conservator. But the conservator has to get paid. So just be aware that it's going to be expensive, and if you can't afford it, then the alternatives are to properly house, which is the term we use when we're talking about putting things in archival boxes, properly house your artifacts, and that at least stabilizes them um, while they're damaged.
Also, conservators often will consult with you for free or for a lesser fee. It's something you can get questions answered in a lot of different ways, and then you can decide where to proceed from there. And just kind of building on what Chris was saying, there are a lot of things, as we've kind of covered in this presentation, fairly simple things you can do at home, not all very terribly expensive, that when you're looking at just how you're handling things, how they're getting stored and organized, and what the environment is like in your home, those really go the longest way when it comes to keeping things preserved. And we just have a little summary here of some of the main points about clean hands and the best times to use gloves, and being aware of unfolding and folding documents back and forth and how that causes them to break, and avoiding tape, sticky notes, paper clips, rubber bands. Again, establishing a system of organization and labeling to pass those stories down and to help you find where things are in an efficient way. Storing items in folders and boxes that are appropriate for them, and displaying copies of photographs. So these are all pretty doable, simple things that you can do at home.
And there's a lot more information we could share with you that we don't have time for. So here are some places that you can go to find additional information. The first one is AIC, which stands for the American Institute for the Conservation of Artistic and Historic Works, or is it Historic and Artistic Works? I think it's that way. Anyway, at that site, they have some information about how to care for your heirlooms, and they also have a conservator referral service, so you can look up conservators near you that you can talk to about your heirlooms. The next two, NEDCC and the Minnesota Historical Society, also have some good information on things you can do to take care of your items. And the last five sell products that you can store your heirlooms within. And also some of them sell products that you can repair your heirlooms with. This last one I wanted to share, the Church History Department in Salt Lake City has a portion of their website at history.lds.org, which is devoted to preservation. And this is how you find it. You go to history.lds.org and then you click on How To, and in the drop-down menu, click on Preserving History. And when you get to that site, there are several instructional videos. There are some videos that are geared specifically toward you, the person at home, and there are other videos that show how the Church History Department takes care of their artifacts. And while they do something that might be more extensive than you could do in your home, you can still learn good principles of preservation from those videos. So I think that's it.
Yeah, hopefully this has been helpful.
Yeah, and if you have any questions, you're welcome to contact us at the, I don't know, where are we?
Yeah, you can find us through the BYU Library website.
Well, thank you very much for the excellent webinar. It was great to get some great tips on preserving artifacts and heirlooms. It's something really important. This webinar will be uploaded to the BYU Family History Library website and downloaded and put on YouTube within the coming days. Be sure to look for it there, and we thank you for participating in the BYU Family History Library webinar series.